Torchbearers of History, a connected series of historical sketches by Amelia Hutchinson Stirling. Part 2, from the fall of the Roman Empire of the West to the Reformation. Chapter 1. King Arthur, the settlement of the Saxons in Britain. We are now going to pass over into the island of Britain. I have told you that for centuries it was part of the great Roman Empire, ruled by a Roman governor and garrisoned by a Roman army. The first description which we have of the island and its people, too, was written by a Roman, the great Julius Caesar, who, you will remember, came over to Britain and conquered some of the native tribes in 55 BC. Though it was not till a century later that the country became a Roman province. At the time when Caesar came over, the inhabitants of Britain were a more simple people, living in mud huts and clothed in the skins of beasts. But during the 300 and more years that they were under the rule of the Roman governors, they learned a great many useful arts from their conquerors. They learned to read and to write, to build stone houses, to weave, and to make roads. Many of them, too, became Christians at this time. Altogether, the conquest of Britain by the civilized people of Rome turned out to be a very good thing for the conquered people, though it was not easy for them to believe that at first. And many times some chief or other, bolder than the rest, rose up in arms to try and free his country from the invader. Meantime, as we have seen, the great empire of Rome was drawing near its end. Though I have made the classical period end with Hypatia, who is indeed the last representative of the purely classical spirit, the Roman Empire of the West, of which the city of Rome was the capital, continued to exist, though in a tottering condition, for 60 years after, till her death in 476 AD. Then the last emperor, who strangely enough had the same name as the founder of the city, Romulus, was deposed by the chief of a German tribe named Odoacer, who, with many of his followers, had fought his way to Rome. The last century or more of the existence of the Roman Empire of the West is remarkable chiefly on account of the inroads from the north and east of the great crowds of tribes, Goths and Vandals they were called, who pressed towards Rome. These people, like the tribe that deposed the last emperor of the West, seem to have been related to the Germans. In the 4th century, another people came into Europe from Asia, the Huns. They were described as ferocious and cruel. They had no settled dwellings, but wandered about with their flocks and herds from place to place. When these people entered Europe, the Goths, who were living in the country about the river Danube, were driven from their homes, and led by the brave Alaric, advanced westwards with their wives and children, their flocks and their herds. Twice before her final fall, the great city of Rome, the mistress of the world, as she used to be called, suffered the disgrace of being besieged and taken by the Gothic chief. It was then, in the first half of the 5th century, that the Romans found it necessary to recall their troops from their more distant provinces, in order to help guard their capital itself from the attacks of the barbarians. Like other countries, Britain was delivered from its Roman garrison and governor, but the state of Britain was not by any means improved by the removal of the Roman troops. The Britons, or at least those living in that part of the island, which is now called England, for the Romans never conquered the whole of Scotland, had become civilized during the centuries that the Romans had governed them, and they had been so long at peace that they had almost forgotten how to fight, so that they were easy to conquer by people accustomed to fighting. Even before the Romans left the island, great bands of the wild Scots would often swoop down upon the Roman province from the north, and do a great deal of mischief, killing and burning and plundering, while the coasts of the islands were frequently attacked by ships of the Saxons, a tribe from the north of Germany. But no sooner were the Romans safely out of the way, than the attacks of the Scots increased, so much that the Britons of the south felt quite unable to resist them, and looked about for someone to help them. It is said that a British king, Vortigern, was foolish enough to ask the Saxons to come and assist him against the Scots, and the two brothers, Hengist and Horsa, came with the army and conquered these wild northerners. But the Britons had only got rid of one enemy to fall into the hands of a worse one. For when the Saxons saw what a good country Britain was, and how weak its people were, they told their friends in Germany to come over, and soon the unfortunate country was overrun by a host of fierce Germans, Angles and Saxons and Jutes, who drove the poor Britons into the mountains of Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland, where their descendants live to this day, many of them still speaking the Celtic language, Welsh in Wales, or Gaelic in Scotland. Before they were fairly conquered, however, you may be sure that many of the bravest British chiefs did their best to save their country from falling into the hands of the fierce Saxons, and the bravest of them all, the one who fought the hardest and the most nobly for his country, was Arthur, the king of the British tribe on the borders of Wales, who lived about the end of the 5th and the beginning of the 6th century. There is not much about Arthur in history. Some historians believe that he was not a real person at all, but there is a great deal about him in the old tales and ballads, and our late great poet, Tennyson, has made him the hero of several of his grandest poems. In the first of his poems about Arthur, The Coming of Arthur, Tennyson gives a very vivid description of the state of Britain after the Romans left it. He tells us how the civilized, peace-loving Britons groaned for the Roman legions here again, and Caesar's eagle, and still, from time to time, the heathen host swarmed overseas and harried what was left, and so there grew great tracts of wilderness, wherein the beast was ever more and more, but man was less and less, till Arthur came. I do not suppose that real Arthur, if he ever lived, was half such a fine man as Tennyson makes him. He was surrounded by a great many knights, noble, brave young men, who had vowed with a solemn oath to reverence the king as if he were their conscience, and their conscience as their king, to break the heathen and uphold the Christ, to ride abroad redressing human wrongs, to speak no slander, no, nor listen to it, to honour his own word as if his God's. But noble as the knights were, none of them could compare with Arthur, God's highest creature here, the noblest, purest, grandest character you can imagine. The old poets have woven a great deal of mystery about the coming of Arthur, his birth and proclamation as king, which we cannot believe nowadays, but which is very beautiful to read about. One story is that, as the old Welsh magician Merlin stood one night on the seashores, a wave washed to his feet an infant who was no other than the future King Arthur. Merlin took the babe and brought him up in solitude, and after many years, when the child grew up to manhood, he came forth before the world and made himself king. At first, a great many people would not acknowledge him as king, but after he had done several noble deeds, and had many times conquered the heathen Saxons in fight, people believed in him, and drew around him many noble followers. Then he formed his brave band of knights, each of whom had taken the oath I told you of before he could become one of the band. They were called the Knights of the Round Table, because the king, not wishing to honour one more than the other, or to set one before another, had a large round table, at which the knights sat at meals, so that no one should have a higher place than his brother knights. So for some years the Christian knights, led by their noble king, waged a brave war against the heathen host of the Angles and Saxons, and many a glorious battle did they win. But gradually, as the years went on, the knights died one by one, or fell away from their allegiance to Arthur, or quarrelled amongst themselves, and at length one forgot so far the oath he had sworn as to go against the king, whom he had vowed to reverence as his conscience. Then Arthur went forth to meet him, not joyfully, as in the olden days when, with his goodly company of knights, he met the Saxon hosts upon the field, but sadly, for, as he said, the king who fights his people fights himself. And they, my knights, who loved me once, they stroke that strikes them dead, as if my death to me. All day long the battle raged, and when evening came, the remnant of the knights had fallen, man by man, about their lord. Only Sir Bedivere, the first of all the knights, was left. He, when the king too fell, wounded on the field, raised him on his shoulders, and bore him to the ruined chapel. Then Arthur, feeling that death was near, put into his last knight's hands his sword, Excalibur, and bade him to fling it into the lake near by, and lightly bring him word of what he saw. For the story runs that the sword was the gift of the mystic lady of the lake. And when first he became king, Arthur had seen an arm, clothed in a white samite, mystic, wonderful, arise from out of the bosom of the lake, holding a sword, whose hilt glittered with diamonds. Then Arthur, so they say, rode out into the lake, and took the sword, which was a marvel of workmanship, and on the blade on one side were the words, "Take me," but on the other, "Throw me away." And now the time has come to throw Excalibur away. Sir Bedivere took the sword as he was bid, but when he came to the margin of the lake, and drew forth the sword to fling it, the jewels on the hilt sparkled, so that in the moonlight that he could not find it in his heart to do what he had come to do. Instead, he hid Excalibur amongst the sedges of the lake, and to King Arthur's question of what he had seen or heard, answered, "I heard the ripple washing in the reeds, and the wild water lapping on the crag." Then Arthur was angry at the disobedience of his knight, and sent him forth again to hurl the sword into the lake. But again the wondrous beauty of the sword so worked upon the knight that he could not fling it away. Again he hid it in the reeds, and returning told the king, "I heard the water lapping on the crag, and the long ripple washing in the reeds." Then great was the anger of the dying king, and so bitterly he rebuked the knight, that Bedivere arose in haste and ran, and took the sword, and with shut eyes flung it into the lake. Then back he came to Arthur, who, breathing heavily, for his end was near, said to him, "Now see I, by thine eyes, that this is done. Speak out, what is it thou hast heard or seen?" So Bedivere told how he had hurled the sword with closed eyes, not trusting himself to look upon it, and how, when he looked again, he saw an arm, clothed in white samite, mystic, wonderful, that took Excalibur, and 3 times brandished it, and drew it under the water. Then, at the bidding of the king, Sir Bedivere bore his helpless body to the margin of the lake, and soon there hove in sight a barge, dark as a funeral scarf from stem to stern, and in it were 3 queens with golden crowns and mourning garments. Sadly, Sir Bedivere placed the wounded king within the barge, as he was bid to do, and then swiftly and silently it glided out of sight into the darkness. Such is the tale that the poets tell. I cannot say that it is true, but this at least we will believe, that centuries ago, when the power of Rome had fallen, there lived in our own land, and fought against the hosts of heathen Angles and Saxons, a noble king, King Arthur, and not in vain he fought, although he was not able to drive the heathen from the country, which bears their name today, England, the land of the Angles.